Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to an album ranking for Metallica, the masters of metal. They've been around since 1981, kicking around now 42 long years, having released 12 studio albums, and with their most recent just coming out 72 seasons on April 14th of 2023 here, I thought what better thing to do than to do an album ranking. And so I'm going to do that now. We'll break down each and every album as part of this, but before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, if you turn on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool episodes just like this with an album ranking for Metallica. All right, now, as I said, 12 studio albums here. That's 11 albums of original material and one covers album, because I have noticed a lot of people calling their latest album the 11th studio album, but that's just of original material. So I wanted to clarify that. Now, of those 12 studio albums, Lulu, which was released in 2011, is not a Metallica album. It's actually a Lou Reed album, and a lot of people get confused with that, and I see that all the time, people wanting to comment one way or the other against, whether Saint Anger's the worst or Lulu, but Lulu is a Lou Reed album, so I'm not including it in this since it is not an outright Metallica album. All right, so we are going to jump in at number 12, and for me at least, Saint Anger from 2003, their 9th studio album, was the last one to be produced by Bob Rock, who also plays bass on this. They did not have an official bass player at the time, and I don't know how much of that influenced it or didn't. 2 million copies were still sold of this album, so despite how you feel about it, it did well for the band. But for me at least, it's sort of just like, what were they thinking? And I still ask that question a lot today. I'm not saying the album is horrible or bad, because I still like it. But the thing is, they changed their musical style. There was no solos. I don't know what's going on with that drum sound on there. The mix of the album itself is just not up to par, in my opinion. And ultimately, I didn't like any of the singles that came off of it. For me, the album really picks up after track 3, starting with track 4 there, and gets a lot better. Favorite track on the album for me is Invisible Kid, and I think that's a stellar song, and I'd still love to hear a remix of this thing. Probably would move this thing up higher in my album ranking. All right, coming in at number 11, Garage Incorporated from 1998, 8th studio album, last to feature bassist Jason Newsted. It is a double album. First disc is all new cover songs, and the second disc is a compilation of older cover songs. If this had only been older cover songs, I would not be including it because of it being a compilation. But outside of that, the first disc being the new cover songs, I am including it for that reason. And I at least took it as, at the time when this album came out, that they did it to counter Load and Reload. There was a very different style sound there. So they gathered up all those old B-sides and everything and released it to put something heavier, something that sounded a bit more classic. And in the end of the day, the thing sold 5 million copies in the US. So again, did very well for them. My favorite tracks, though, Die Die My Darling, the Misfits cover song, and Whiskey in the Jar, which is a traditional Irish folk song but made famous by Thin Lizzy, and it was just really cool to hear what Metallica did to those two songs. Coming in at number 10, Reload from 1997, 7th studio album from the band. This one here being a companion to the previous album, Load, which came out in 1996. Recorded at the same time, but then they went in a year later, polished off whatever they needed to do, tweak, a track here or there kind of thing to release it. And in the end, sold 4 million copies. So despite what a lot of people think as far as, not liking that new direction that they went on this, these two albums, Load and Reload, it still did well for the band, and sold as well as early albums like Kill 'Em All and stuff like that. But basically, if you were a fan of Load from 1996, you were going to like this album. But if you weren't a fan of that stuff, there was no way you were going to get into this here. I always liked the song Carpe Diem on here. That was my favorite track off of it. A lot of good tracks, though, even though this was more in the groove metal style and not the traditional thrash metal that we had come up used to with Metallica. Coming in at number 9, Load from 1996, sixth studio album. This one here featured a 5-year gap since the 1991 release of the Black Album, which changed everything in metal. And at that time really was like an eternity, 5 years between albums. You know, very few bands did that, very few bands survived, but they were so big. I think no matter what they did at that point, it was going to be successful for them. And ultimately went on to sell 5 million copies of this album. But gone was the signature thrash style sound, you know, of the earlier first 5 albums. In place of that was that slower groove metal that again continued on Reload. And there was also a lot of blues influence in this, and that was sort of said to have come from Kirk Hammett. They really allowed all 4 members to write on this one here. But that blues influence could be heard in 2x4, Mama Said, stuff like that. My favorite track on the album was actually the first single, Until It Sleeps. I'm not usually a singles person, but that one there I really thought was a great track. Coming in at number 8, their brand new album, 72 Seasons, just released April 14th of 2023, 12th studio album. 11 when we're talking about albums of original material. So if you guys did recently see my full review of this album, of which I will leave a link in the description below if you want to check that out, I refer to it there as the 11th studio album of original material. But 7 years since their previous album, Hardwired to Selfdestruct, which came out in 2016, and just seems like in their later years they're getting longer and longer between releases. And I don't know if that helps or hurts them, but you know, sometimes absent makes the heart grow fonder, so that next album that comes out is even better because you've waited so long. So maybe it's working to their advantage, who knows. Too early for any kind of sales data. In fact, at the time of doing this, the album hasn't even been out a week, so I don't even know where it is placing on the Billboard album chart, but it'll probably do pretty well for them. I am split on this album. 12 tracks that are all heavy, bone-crushingly hard, but they're all kind of the same sound on it. You know, no peaks and valleys. I really like the peaks and valleys in my music. And that's what a lot of their earlier albums have and so forth, and this one doesn't. So again, as I said, I'm kind of on the fence about it regarding that, but I do like the album a lot. Favorite track, Inamorata, the very last one on here, has the most different sound of anything that's on this album, although not different from other stuff. Kind of sounds a lot like The Unforgiven, but not quite as in that slowness of pace, but still in that vein. Okay, number 7, Hardwired to Selfdestruct from 2016, 11th studio album. 8 years since the previous album, Death Magnetic, in 2008. This one is a double album, which I thought was really strange because all of the music would have fit on one disc, but they broke it into 2, and I think that comes down to how they wanted the album to be represented, and especially to come across in terms of sales figures, because the album itself has sold over 1 million copies in the US. But since it's a double album, what it really means is it has sold 500,000 copies, because at 2 discs, that's where you get the 1 million numbers from on. That's how double albums have always been counted, as in 2 units. So, you know, you only have to sell half as many copies to sound like you're doing good. And that's just my opinion on it, because when it all fits on one disc, why do it? But then again, we can get into whether or not they did this for vinyl reasons and other stuff and so forth. But disc 1, perfect album in my opinion. I love it. It's fantastic. Disc 2 is where it sort of loses it for me, and you know, begins to meander a bit, and just didn't like a few of the tracks that were there. So could have been an absolute stellar album. Don't know if it would have changed if it had all been on one disc or not. I don't like having to pull out, and so what happens is you know, to change the disc, where I end up not always listening to the whole thing all the way through, because I just listen to one of the discs, take it out, go to something else instead of putting the second disc on, even though in a standard Metallica album, it's no longer in length. Favorite track, Moth to Flame. I absolutely love that song. It is a burner, just an absolute stellar track from them. Coming in at number 6, Death Magnetic, 2008, 10th studio album. This one here, 5 years since previous album, Saint Anger, which again seemed like a really long time at that point, especially if you weren't a fan of Saint Anger. You had to wait all the time to get that album, then to not like it, you basically had to wait double that amount of time for them to redeem themselves, which in my opinion they did. This one here is the first album to feature new bassist Robert Trujillo, coming from Suicidal Tendencies, Infectious Grooves, Ozzy Osbourne. And he's now actually been with the band for 20 years, so longer than their two previous bass players. The album itself produced by Rick Rubin, who I think helped them make a return to form album. Now, no, this is definitely not like the stuff of the 80s, but it is as close as they are ever going to get, in my opinion, and that's just due to time and age and all that sort of stuff. But it does feature one of my all-time favorite Metallica songs, The Day That Never Comes. When this song kicks in and then the soloing starts, it's absolutely blistering, and I think some of Kirk Hammett's best guitar work. Coming in at number 5, Kill 'Em All from 1983, debut solo album. Over 4 million copies sold of this one. While the band still sounds quite raw on this album here, it's their first recording, I do think that it has many stellar tracks on it. So I kind of look that aside from things as far as the recording quality of it, and instead look at the classicness. And not to mention, it actually features some co-writes from Dave Mustaine of Megadeth, who was a one-time member of the group, and I always thought that's kind of cool, giving the album a very interesting feel as to what it might have sounded like had he stayed in the band. And so I've always enjoyed the album from that perspective. My favorite track on here, Hit the Lights, again, is just an absolute brutal, heavy track and the way to go to kick off the album. Coming in at number 4, Ride the Lightning from 1984, second studio album, also features a co-write on here from Dave Mustaine on the title track. And I listen to that and I just think, man, I would love to hear those guys collaborate on something. I'm sure it wouldn't be quite what it is today as it was back then, but over 6 million copies sold of this album here, still sounding a bit raw on this one here, but the songwriting for me at least grew by leaps and bounds, which is what puts it over the Kill 'Em All album itself and why it's ranking where it does. And I love the opening track, Fight Fire with Fire. Just an absolutely, again, brutal song. When they will open their show on occasion, they'll open their show with it, and I love it. Coming in at number 3, and Justice for All, 1988, fourth studio album. First to feature new bassist Jason Newsted on a full-length album. I know he recorded on the EP, Garage Days, but this here was first album of original material. So he came from Flotsam and Jetsam, following, of course, the tragic death of Cliff Burton. And there's always been a lot of controversy regarding the mix of this album here, its lack of bass. And to be quite honest, it never bothered me. But then when I was listening to this back in 1988, that's just the way the album sounded. Their albums had not been sort of very stellar produced at that point. And so that was just how it was. And I grew up with that, and that's what it was. So I've never really been bothered by it. I think in later years people have loved to debate that and so forth, but I don't think it was that big a deal at the time. I certainly did not have any friends going around saying, man, the lack of bass on this thing. Kind of became an issue later on, but the songwriting on it is amazing, and I think got some true epics on this one here, featuring some of their longest songs too, which was a cool thing. Favorite track is the title track on here, In Justice for All. Coming in at number 2, Master of Puppets, 1986, third studio album, last to feature bassist Cliff Burton. The tragedy also cut short the promotion of this album, which by that point had sold 1 million copies without a video, without radio play, no backing by MTV, nothing like that. They still managed to sell 1 million copies by word of mouth alone. And while the album itself would go on to sell 7 million copies, and it's nearing 8 million right now, it kind of always made me wonder what would have happened had the tragedy not struck and the tour had not been cut short and so forth. Could it have gone even further at that time? Where would we be at today? One will never know at this point, but the band really comes into their own here, I think. There's great songs. There's much better production on this, losing that raw sound from the first two, which I think is why I like this album so much. It's got some amazing epic tracks on it. Battery, Master of Puppets, the title track, which is also currently riding high because it was used in the TV show Stranger Things, so cool. Kudos to them for doing that. Welcome Home Sanitarium on here, but my favorite track is actually the instrumental Orion. I absolutely love that one. All right, and the number 1 album from Metallica, in my opinion at least, the Black Album from 1991. Probably no surprise to most of you. Fifth studio album, arguably the greatest metal album of all time, at least in sales. If nothing else, you gotta admit that, because with over 17 million copies sold, it is the largest selling metal album of all time. First album produced by Bob Rock, who would kick off a lasting relationship for 12 long years, doing 5 albums. This album did for metal what Nirvana's Nevermind did for grunge and alternative rock. It just opened the floodgates. It made thrash metal popular, mainstream. I mean, in 1991, that was a really hard thing to do. Metal of other kinds was on the downturn, but they broke the gates open, and it was very cool that that happened. My favorite track on here, Through the Never, love that song. The guitar on that one and the riff I just think is stellar. You couldn't get away from this album for 2 years at the time, between 1991, its release, and 1993, the end of them touring. The band was just relentlessly on the road. They were all over MTV, released 5 singles and videos. The radio played everything. This is when mandatory Metallica and stuff and all that sort of things got underway, so you were hearing tons of Metallica all the time. Unfortunately, it kind of burnt me out on the album itself, and it is one of those ones that I kind of feel like I never need to hear again, and I've talked about that, but at the same time, I can't deny its classicness. It was the first Metallica album that I bought of my own, and I absolutely loved it. I went and saw them 4 times on tour at that point, so at least for that and its classicness and everything as to why, at least for me, it is coming in at number 1. So there you go. That is the Metallica album ranking, at least as I see it. I'm sure you guys have difference of opinions, and that's cool. Let me know your thoughts. Otherwise, have a good one. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.